The dust of Redemption Creek settled on everything, a fine, gritty powder that coated the soul. It clung to the brim of Silas's hat and worked its way into the creases of his leather gloves. He rode into the settlement, not on a whim, but with a purpose that sat heavy and cold in his gut. His horse, Titan, a great black beast with a spirit as untamed as the plains they crossed, shifted beneath him, sensing the foul air of the place. The town was little more than a single muddy street lined with false-fronted buildings, a festering sore on the face of the territory. At its heart was the saloon, a den of noise and rot from which a crowd had spilled, their voices a low, brutish hum. They formed a loose circle around a wooden platform. On it stood two figures. One was Jedediah Thorne, a man whose wealth was built on the misery of others. His face was a fleshy map of greed, his eyes small and hard like pebbles. The other figure was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, with hair the color of sun-scorched straw and eyes that were vast, empty pools of blue. He stood unnaturally still, a small, rigid statue of terror. He was barefoot, his clothes little more than rags. Thorne held a leather lead, the end of which was tied loosely around the boy's wrist, as if he were a prize calf. A strong back, this one, Thorne boomed, his voice slick with false bonhomie. Good for fetching, for mucking out. Silent, too. Won't trouble you with chatter. A few men chuckled. A harsh, ugly sound. Silas reined Titan to a halt at the edge of the crowd. He didn't dismount. He just watched, his own face as still and unreadable as a stone carving. He saw the tremor in the boy's hands, the way his gaze was fixed on a point beyond the leering faces, a point of escape that did not exist. Thorne was working the crowd, trying to auction the boy off for a handful of silver, a debt supposedly owed by the boy's family. But the men were hesitant, their cruelty tempered by a sliver of caution. Owning a man was one thing. Owning a child was another kind of trouble. The bidding was sluggish, insulting. Thorne's face soured. "He's worth more than that," he snarled, giving the lead a sharp tug. The boy stumbled, but made no sound. Not a cry, not a whimper. Just that terrifying, unnatural silence. It was the silence that did it. It snagged on something deep inside Silas, something he thought long dead and buried. He nudged Titan forward, the crowd parting before the great horse like a tide receding from a rock. All eyes turned to him. Thorne's gaze narrowed. "You have a bid, stranger?" Silas didn't answer immediately. He looked from Thorne's sneering face to the boy's hollow eyes. He saw a flicker of something in their depths, a spark not yet extinguished. Then he looked at Titan, his companion for 1,000 lonely miles, the finest horse he had ever owned or seen. The animal was his freedom, his legs, his fortune. He swung a leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground, his boots sinking into the muck. He held Titan's reins in one hand. "I do," Silas said, his voice a low rumble, unused and rough. He didn't offer coin. He didn't offer a deed. He held out the reins, the horse for the boy. A gasp went through the crowd. Thorne's eyes widened, first in disbelief, then in avarice. He looked at Titan, his gaze sweeping over the powerful muscles, the intelligent eyes, the sheer presence of the animal. A horse like that was worth a small fortune, 100 times what he could hope to get for the child. The trade was madness. It was a fool's bargain. Thorne's lips peeled back into a triumphant grin. He unlooped the lead from the boy's wrist and tossed it into the mud. "Done," he spat, snatching Titan's reins from Silas's hand before he could change his mind. Silas didn't look at the horse. He couldn't. He turned his back on his only friend and walked to the platform. He crouched, bringing his eyes level with the silent child. The boy Finn just stared, unblinking. Silas held out his hand. The boy flinched but didn't move. So Silas simply waited, his calloused hand open and steady in the space between them. After a long moment, a small trembling hand rose and settled into his. It was as light as a dead leaf. Silas closed his fingers around it gently and stood, leading the boy away from the platform, away from the town, away from the life that had almost claimed him. A crowd watched them go, a silent man and a silent boy, walking east into the vast, empty plains, leaving the greatest horse in the territory behind. The world shrank to the rhythmic crunch of their boots on the dry earth. Silas had a spare mule, a cantankerous old beast named Dust, packed with his meager supplies. He set the boy atop the mule, adjusting the bedroll to cushion his small frame. The boy, Finn, held on to the saddle horn with white-knuckled hands, his body swaying with the animal's gait, but never relaxing. He was a stone carried on a slow-moving river. Silas walked beside them, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. The silence between them was not a comfortable one. It was a chasm wide and deep, filled with all the things the boy could not say and all the things Silas would not ask. The sun beat down, relentless. Hours passed. Silas offered his canteen. The boy shook his head. Silas stopped, uncorked it, and held it to the boy's lips. Finn stared at him, his blue eyes wary, searching for a trick, a price. Silas's gaze was steady. He just waited. Finally, the boy parted his lips and took a small, hesitant sip. He did not drink deeply. He drank just enough to survive. That seemed to be the principle by which he lived. Do just enough. Be just enough. Attract no notice. Silas understood that kind of survival. He had lived it himself for more years than he cared to count. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the horizon, they made camp in the shelter of a rock outcropping. Silas built a fire, the small flames pushing back the immense darkness of the prairie. He cooked bacon and beans in a small skillet. The smell filled the air, rich and savory. He divided the meal onto 2 tin plates. He set one down near the boy, who had huddled himself in a blanket by the rocks, as far from Silas as he could get while remaining within the fire's light. Silas ate his own meal slowly, his eyes on the fire. He didn't watch the boy. He gave him the privacy of his fear. After a long time, he heard the faint scrape of a fork against tin. When he finally glanced over, the plate was empty. He nodded to himself. A small, almost imperceptible movement. It was a start. Later, as the boy slept a fitful, shallow sleep, Silas sat staring into the flames. He took a small block of pine from his saddlebag and his whittling knife. The blade was old, worn smooth by his thumb. He began to carve, the motions familiar, automatic. Shavings fell like soft curls of snow onto his dusty trousers. He wasn't carving anything in particular. He was just letting his hands work, letting the familiar motion quiet the unease in his chest. He had given up his horse. He had traded freedom for a responsibility he did not understand. He looked at the sleeping child, a small, wounded creature curled against the cold stone. He felt no sense of righteousness, no pride in his grand gesture. He felt only a profound and unsettling weight. He had pulled this child from one fire, but he did not know if he was leading him to safety or simply into a different kind of wilderness. The prairie was unforgiving. It demanded strength. This boy was a whisper in a windstorm. Before he banked the fire for the night, a sound cut through the chirping of the crickets. A low, keening cry from the boy's sleep. A nightmare. Silas moved to his side. He didn't touch him. He didn't speak. He just stood there, a large, solid presence in the darkness, until the crying subsided and the boy's breathing evened out again. The silence returned, but it had changed. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the boy's unseen terrors. The homestead was not a home. It was a bulwark against the world, a place of function, not comfort. The cabin was small, built of sturdy logs chinked with mud and moss, with a single stone chimney that rose like a stubborn finger against the wide sky. A small barn stood nearby, leaning slightly to the east as if tired of fighting the wind. A half-finished fence marked a boundary that nothing in nature respected. This was Silas's world, stark and solitary. When they arrived, Finn slid off the mule and stood in the yard, a tiny figure dwarfed by the emptiness. He looked at the cabin, the barn, the endless horizon, his expression unchanged. It was just another place, another box to be put in. Silas unsaddled the mule and turned it out into the small, fenced pasture. He carried their supplies into the cabin. The inside was as Spartan as the outside. A single bed frame with a straw mattress, a stone hearth, a rough-hewn table with one chair. A few shelves held tins of food, a stack of worn books, and an assortment of tools. It smelled of wood smoke, leather, and loneliness. Silas gestured to the bed. "Yours," he said. The single word hung in the air. He would take the floor. The boy looked at the bed, then back at Silas, a question in his eyes he could not voice. Silas simply turned away and began unpacking the supplies, his movements economical and precise. He gave the boy a choice he had likely never had, to accept or refuse the small comfort. After a moment, Finn walked to the bed and sat on its edge, his feet not quite touching the floorboards. The first few days passed in a silent routine. Silas rose before the sun. He mended the weak spots in the barn roof. He went out to check his trap lines, returning with a rabbit or two for the pot. He split firewood, the rhythmic thud of the axe the only regular sound. Finn was a shadow. He stayed inside the cabin, never venturing past the door. He watched Silas through the single wavy glass window. He watched him work. He watched him eat. He watched him sit by the fire at night, carving his block of wood. He never got too close. He never made a sound. He simply observed, cataloging the man's habits, searching for the patterns that would predict danger. He found none. He found only consistency. He found a man who moved slowly, spoke rarely, and treated the world with a quiet, deliberate respect. One evening, Silas finished his carving. He had been working on it for nights, the small shape emerging gradually from the wood. It was a horse. A simple, blocky figure, but the arch of its neck and the power in its stance were unmistakable. It was Titan. He sanded it smooth with a piece of worn leather, then walked over to the bed where Finn was pretending to be asleep. He placed the small wooden horse on the blanket beside the boy's hand. He didn't say a word. He just left it there, a silent offering. He went back to his spot by the fire, his back to the bed. He heard a tiny rustle of the blanket. He did not turn. In the morning, the wooden horse was gone. Silas glanced at the boy's bunk. Finn was still there, his eyes closed, but his small hand was tucked tightly under the blanket, clutching the small, smooth shape. A piece of the silence had been filled. Winter was coming. Silas could feel it in the bite of the wind that swept down from the northern mountains, a wind that carried the scent of snow and iron. The days grew shorter, the light thinner. He spent his time reinforcing the cabin, chinking the logs with fresh mud and moss, banking earth against the foundation to keep out the drafts. He needed more meat for the winter, more than his small trap lines could provide. He would have to go farther, into the high country where the deer and elk were more plentiful. He was hesitant to leave the boy. Finn had begun to venture out of the cabin, but only as far as the woodpile. He would watch Silas work, a silent apprentice. He had even started to help in small ways, gathering kindling and stacking it in a neat pile by the door. But the world beyond the fence was still a source of terror for him. Silas knew he had no choice. Survival was a harsh master. He packed supplies for 2 days, saddling the mule. He stood before Finn at the cabin door. "I'll be back," he said. He pointed to the woodpile. "Keep the fire going." It was the most he had ever asked of him. The boy looked up, his face pale. He gave a single, jerky nod. Silas turned and left, the boy's small figure framed in the doorway shrinking behind him as he rode away. The high country was cold and stark, the trees already bare. He found deer tracks on the second day, fresh ones. He followed them up a steep, rocky ravine, his rifle ready. The tracks were clear in the damp earth, but then he saw them. Other prints, smaller, barefoot. His body went rigid. No animal made those marks. He forgot the deer. His hunter's instincts, honed by years of tracking game, now focused on this new, disturbing trail. The prints were stumbling, erratic, the tracks of someone weak and desperate. He followed them with a growing sense of dread. They led him away from the open trail, into a thicket of pine and tangled brush, toward a sheer rock face. There, hidden in a deep crevice behind a curtain of dead vines, was a makeshift shelter. A hovel, really, built of fallen branches and packed with leaves. A faint, sickly sweet smell hung in the air. Silas pushed the vines aside. The light was dim inside, but he could make out a figure huddled under a pile of rags. He thought it was a man at first, another lost soul hiding from the world. He took a step closer. The figure stirred, and a woman's face, gaunt and smeared with dirt, turned towards him. Her eyes were wide with a fierce, feral terror. They were the same startling blue as the boy's. Her lips were cracked and bloody. One of her arms was wrapped in a dirty bandage, and her leg was bent at an unnatural angle. In her hand, she clutched a sharpened rock, holding it like a dagger. "Stay back," she rasped, her voice a dry whisper of sound, but filled with a surprising venom. Silas stopped. He held up his empty hands slowly. He looked at her, at the raw desperation etched into her face, at the familiar stubborn pride in her eyes. He saw the tattered dress, the bare, bruised feet. He saw the slow, deliberate path of her suffering, a path he now understood had been parallel to his own. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, who she was. He had been tracking a ghost, and he had found her. He had found Finn's mother. The woman, Ilara, watched him with the unblinking intensity of a cornered animal. Every muscle in her body was coiled, ready to fight, to flee, to die. Silas remained still, his hands open and visible. He did not speak. Words would be useless here. They would be sounds of aggression, threats. He slowly lowered himself to one knee, making himself smaller, less imposing. He took his canteen from his belt, uncorked it, and placed it on the ground, sliding it gently across the dirt floor of her shelter until it was within her reach. Her eyes darted from his face to the canteen and back again. Thirst warred with suspicion. Finally, her gaze fixed on his. "The boy," she whispered, her voice cracking. "My Finn. Do you have him?" Silas nodded once. A shudder went through her. It wasn't relief, not yet. It was a confirmation of her deepest fear, that her son was in the hands of a stranger, another man in a world of cruel men. "Where?" she demanded. "Safe," Silas said. The single word seemed to hang in the cold air. He had no other proof to offer. Just that one word, spoken in a voice that held no deception. He backed out of the crevice, giving her space. He built a small fire, a short distance away, and cooked the last of his bacon. The smell drifted into her shelter, a potent lure. He ate his portion and left the rest in the skillet on a warm rock. Then he sat with his back to her, watching the sun dip below the jagged peaks. He waited. An hour passed. Then he heard a faint sound behind him. He didn't turn. He heard the scrape of the skillet being dragged across the rock, the soft clink of a fork. When he finally looked, the skillet was empty. He had passed her test for now. She was too weak to walk. Her leg was broken, badly set by her own hand. There was no choice. He went back to the crevice. She flinched as he entered, the sharpened rock still in her hand. "I can't leave you here," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Winter will kill you." "You'll kill me first," she retorted, but the fire in her voice had dimmed. "If I was going to, I'd have done it already," he said simply. He held out his arms. Her eyes, so like her son's, searched his face for any sign of a lie, any hint of malice. She found none. She saw only a weary resignation, a man burdened by a choice he had made. With a ragged sigh that sounded like a surrender, she let the rock fall from her hand. It landed in the dirt with a soft thud. Silas lifted her. She was shockingly light, a bundle of sharp bones and fierce will. He carried her out into the fading light, and with painstaking care, secured her onto the mule. The journey back was slow, agonizing. Every step of the mule sent a jolt of pain through her. She bore it in silence, her teeth gritted. Silas walked beside her, his hand resting on her good leg to steady her, a point of solid, unthreatening contact. They arrived back at the homestead well after dark. The cabin was a beacon in the blackness, a single square of warm, yellow light. As they drew closer, the door creaked open. Finn stood there, a small silhouette against the firelight. He had kept the fire going. His eyes widened as he saw the figure on the mule. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. Ilara's breath hitched. "Finn," she whispered, the name a prayer on her lips. The boy stopped. He stared. His face, which had been a mask of stoic emptiness for weeks, began to crumble. His mouth opened, and for the first time since Silas had met him, a sound emerged. It was not a word. It was a broken, strangled cry, a sound of such profound, wrenching relief that it seemed to tear through the very fabric of the night. He ran, stumbling across the frozen yard, and collapsed against the mule, his small hands clutching at his mother's tattered dress. The cabin was no longer a space for one, or even two. It was now a fortress for three, filled with the explosive, dangerous mixture of reunion, suspicion, and pain. The air inside the small cabin grew thick with unspoken things. It was a space charged with Ilara's fierce, protective suspicion and Silas's stoic, unyielding patience. He set her down on his own bed, the one the boy had been using, and Finn immediately scrambled up beside her, a small, loyal guard dog who refused to leave her side. Silas moved with a quiet purpose that bordered on ritual. He fetched water. He stoked the fire until it blazed, pushing back the encroaching cold. He examined Ilara's leg. It was a bad break, the bone clearly visible where it had pushed against the skin. Infection had already begun to set in, a faint red tracery spreading from the wound. She watched his every move, her body tensed, her hand never far from the small knife he'd seen her tuck into her waistband. "Don't touch me," she warned, her voice low and dangerous, when he reached for the makeshift splint. Silas met her gaze. He didn't argue. He simply went to a small chest at the foot of the bed and took out a bottle of whiskey, a clean rag, and a long, thin needle threaded with gut. He placed them on the small table beside the bed, along with a strip of leather. "It'll need to be cleaned," he said, his voice flat, stating a fact, not a demand. "And set, or you'll lose the leg." He looked at her, then at Finn, who was watching them with wide, terrified eyes. The unspoken message was clear, not just for you, for him. He then turned his back on them and went to the hearth, busying himself with preparing a thin broth. He gave her the illusion of control, of choice, though they both knew there was none. The pain must have been a fire in her bones. After nearly an hour of tense silence, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the howling of the wind outside, she spoke. "All right," she said, the word clipped, defeated. Silas turned. He moved to the bedside. He handed her the strip of leather. "Bite on this." She took it, her jaw set. He worked quickly, his large hands surprisingly gentle. He cleaned the wound with the harsh whiskey. She didn't scream. but a low groan escaped through her clenched teeth, and her knuckles turned white as she gripped the leather. He set the bone with a swift, brutal efficiency that made her whole body arch in agony. Finn cried out, a small, sharp sound of empathy. Silas fashioned a proper splint from 2 flat pieces of kindling and strips of clean cloth, binding the leg tight and straight. When he was done, he was sweating, and Alara was pale and trembling, her forehead beaded with sweat. He covered her with a thick wool blanket. He handed Finn a cup of the warm broth. "Give this to her," he instructed. The boy did as he was told, holding the cup to his mother's lips with shaking hands. Silas retreated to his corner by the fire, leaving the small island of the bed to them. He had breached her defenses, not with force, but with a necessary act of care. The balance of power had shifted, just slightly. The tension remained, but it was now laced with a thread of grudging respect. She had seen that his hands were not just for violence. They could also be for mending. And he had seen the true depth of her strength, a resilience that burned brighter than any fire he could build. Weeks bled into one another, marked not by days, but by the slow healing of Alara's leg and the gradual thawing of the ice between them. The cabin became their entire world, a small, self-contained universe of 3. The routine that Silas had established alone now expanded to include them. A silent, intricate dance of survival. Alara, confined to the bed, took over the mending. She patched the holes in Finn's shirt with thread unraveled from one of Silas's old flour sacks. She sewed a button onto Silas's coat, her fingers nimble despite her weakness. Each small act of domesticity was a stitch, pulling their disparate lives a little closer together. Finn, emboldened by his mother's presence, became Silas's shadow in earnest. He followed him on his rounds to the barn, his short legs working to keep up with the man's long strides. He learned to scatter feed for the chickens, his movements a careful imitation of Silas's. He would sit on the floor by the hearth while Silas cleaned his rifle, watching the man's methodical, practiced motions. There was no talk, no formal instruction. There was only observation and imitation, the oldest way of learning. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, piling snow against the windows and door, Alara spoke. The story came out in broken pieces, like shards of glass. She spoke of the farm she and her husband had built from nothing, a patch of green in a dry land. She spoke of Jedediah Thorne's insatiable hunger for land, his threats, his intimidation. Her husband had refused to sell. So Thorne and his men had come one night. They'd killed him. They said the land was theirs now, she whispered, her voice hollow, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames. Said the deed was just a formality. They took Finn to make sure I signed. She had escaped that night, fleeing into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back, a raw primal instinct to survive and to somehow, someday, get her son back. She had been tracking them, living like an animal, for weeks. Silas listened without interruption. He did not offer words of comfort or pity. He knew such words were cheap, useless. Instead, when she was finished, her voice choked with grief. He simply got up and put another log on the fire, the solid, reassuring thud echoing in the quiet room. The act was a promise. I will keep you warm. I will keep you safe. Later that night, he saw Alara watching him as he sat in his usual spot, whittling. He was working on a new carving. She couldn't see what it was. He worked slowly, the knife seeming to know its own way. He was a man of few words, but his hands spoke a language of their own. They spoke of patience, of creation, of building things meant to last. She looked from his strong, calloused hands to the sleeping face of her son, a peace on his features she hadn't seen in a year. For the first time since Thorne had ridden onto her land, a fragile, tentative shoot of hope began to push its way through the frozen soil of her heart. The man who had bought her son for a horse was not her enemy. He was something else entirely. something she did not yet have a name for. The thaw came, but it was a false one. A few days of weak sunshine melted the top layer of snow, turning the world to a sea of mud and slush before the temperature plummeted again, freezing everything in a sheath of slick, hard ice. It was on one of these deceptively bright mornings that the shadow fell across their land. Silas was splitting wood, the crisp crack of the axe the only sound when he saw it. A rider, a black speck against the white expanse, moving slowly along the ridge a mile to the west. He stopped, the axe held loosely in his hand. He was too far away to be a lost traveler. His movements were too deliberate. He was a scout. Finn, who was gathering the split logs, saw the stillness in Silas and followed his gaze. The boy's body went rigid. Elara appeared in the doorway, leaning on a crude crutch Silas had made for her. She saw the rider, and the color drained from her face. The fragile piece they had built shattered like a pane of thin ice. They were found. The rider made a slow, lazy circle on the ridge, a vulture marking its prey. He sat there for a long time, an ominous sentinel, before turning his horse and disappearing back the way he had come. He didn't need to come any closer. The message had been delivered. Thorn knew where they were. The rest of them would be coming. Silence descended on the homestead once more, but this time it was different. It was not the silence of healing or of caution. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of dread. That night, no one slept. The fire in the hearth seemed to burn low, offering little comfort. Elara sat in the single chair, her mending lying forgotten in her lap, her eyes wide and dark in the flickering light. Finn was curled on the bed, but his stillness was feigned. Silas could see the tension in his small frame. The fear in the cabin was a palpable thing, a fourth presence in the room. But beneath Elara's fear, something else was hardening. The hunted look in her eyes was slowly being replaced by a glint of defiance. She had been a victim for too long. She had run, she had hidden, she had starved, but she was not just a survivor anymore. She was a mother. She looked over at Silas. He sat by the window, a dark, unmoving silhouette against the moonlit snow. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't pacing. He was simply watching, waiting. His calm was not the calm of ignorance, but of acceptance. He had known this day might come. When he traded his horse, he had not just bought a boy. He had bought the boy's trouble too. He had inherited a war. He had chosen this. The choice, once made, was a part of him now, as solid and real as the rifle that leaned against the wall beside him. The false thaw was over. The real winter was about to begin. The days that followed were a quiet, methodical preparation for violence. There was no discussion of strategy, no debate over what to do. The decision had already been made in the silent exchange of glances between Silas and Elara the moment they saw the rider. They would not run. This small patch of land, this sturdy cabin, had become more than a shelter. It had become a home. And they would defend it. Silas moved with a chilling, focused economy. He spent a day melting lead and casting bullets, the small, heavy spheres lining up in neat rows on the table. He cleaned his rifle and his sidearm with meticulous care, the oiled click of metal on metal, a sharp counterpoint to the howling wind. He took down the heavy wooden shutters, stored in the barn since he built the place, and barred the windows, plunging the cabin into a dim, perpetual twilight lit only by the fire and a single lantern. The world outside was erased. Only the world within mattered now. He brought in a barrel of water from the well, and every last piece of split firewood, stacking it high against the wall. He was turning the cabin into a fortress, a small, defiant island in a sea of white. He did not do it alone. Elara, her legs still healing, but her spirit forged into steel, became his quartermaster. She organized their meager supplies of food, rationing them. She tore strips from old blankets to make extra bandages. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a fierce, protective anger. They had taken her husband. They had taken her son. They would not take this. They would not take her again. One afternoon, Silas pressed the spare shotgun into her hands. It was heavy and awkward. "You know how to use one?" he asked. She shook her head. He didn't lecture her. He simply showed her how to break it open, how to load the shells, how to cock the hammer and sight down the barrel. His hands guided hers, his touch impersonal, instructional. "It kicks hard," he said. "Brace it against your shoulder. Aim for the center." He made her practice loading and unloading until the motions were second nature, until her fumbling fingers grew steady. He gave her a weapon, but he also gave her a share of the responsibility. She was not a damsel to be protected. She was a soldier in this fight. He gave Finn a job, too. The most important one of all. He pointed to the hearth. "You have one task," Silas told him, his voice low and serious. "No matter what happens, no matter what you hear, you keep this fire going." The boy looked from the hearth to Silas's face, his own expression solemn. He understood. The fire was more than warmth. It was their heart. It was their life. To let it die would be to surrender. He nodded, a single sharp dip of his chin. He was no longer just a boy. He was the keeper of the flame. As the sun set on the third day, casting long blue shadows across the snow, they were ready. The three of them sat in the dim, quiet cabin, a broken family forged in silence, now united against the coming storm. The storm arrived just after midnight. It came not as a gradual buildup of wind and snow, but as a sudden, violent onslaught, as if the sky itself had cracked open. A blizzard descended, a swirling vortex of white that erased the moon and stars and reduced visibility to mere feet. It was the perfect cover. Inside the cabin, the only sound was the roar of the wind and the crackle of the fire Finn dutifully tended. Then, another sound. A splintering crash from the barn. The first shot. It wasn't aimed at the cabin. It was aimed at the mule. A cruel and casual act of spite. Silas, who had been sitting motionless in a chair angled toward the door, did not flinch. His eyes, accustomed to the gloom, were fixed on the reinforced wood. Alara stood against the far wall, the shotgun clutched in her hands, her knuckles white. She was terrified, but she did not tremble. The first wave of them came on foot, dark figures materializing out of the swirling snow. They expected an easy fight, a lone man and a woman. They were wrong. A blast of gunfire erupted from the front of the cabin as a man tried the door. The heavy plank shuddered, but the bar held. A cry of pain and surprise was snatched away by the wind. Silas fired through one of the narrow slits he'd left in the shutters. A single deliberate shot. Another man fell. The attack became a siege. Bullets thudded into the thick logs of the cabin, sending splinters flying. The air grew thick with the smell of gunpowder and hot metal. Silas moved with a deadly grace that was terrifying to behold. He was no longer a quiet rancher. Every movement was precise, efficient, born of a past he never spoke of. He fired, reloaded, and shifted positions, making it seem as if there were more than one defender inside. A face appeared at the window slit on the far side of the cabin. Before Silas could turn, a deafening roar filled the small space. Alara had fired the shotgun. The recoil sent her stumbling back against the wall, her shoulder aching, but the window was empty. A look of grim, shocked triumph flashed across her face. She had done it. She had fought back. She reloaded with shaking hands, the practiced motions taking over. Jedediah Thorne's voice bellowed from the storm, full of rage and disbelief. "Burn them out." A torch flared in the blizzard, a flickering orange light that cast mad shadows. A man ran toward the cabin, holding it high. Silas drew a bead on him, but another attacker pinned him down with a volley of shots. The man with the torch was almost to the wall. Suddenly, the back door, A smaller, less used exit near the hearth flew open. Elara had unbarred it. She stood framed in the doorway, a silhouette against the firelight, and fired the second barrel of the shotgun. The man with the torch crumpled into the snow, the flame extinguished with a hiss. She slammed the door and barred it just as a hail of bullets tore through the wood where she had been standing. The fight raged, a chaotic symphony of wind, fire, and death. It was brutal, personal, and fought in the claustrophobic confines of a storm. Inside, the three defenders held their ground. Elara, the resilient survivor, Finn, the keeper of the flame, and Silas, the stoic protector, who had found something on this desolate patch of land that he was, to his own surprise, willing to die for. The violence ended as abruptly as it began. A final desperate rush on the cabin door was met with the last of Silas's ammunition. A silence fell, broken only by the mournful howl of the blizzard. For a long time, no one moved. The silence outside was absolute. Thorne and his men were either dead, wounded, or had fled into the storm to die. As the first pale light of dawn filtered through the slits in the shutters, the wind began to subside. The world outside was white and still, a fresh canvas scrubbed clean by the storm. Silas unbarred the door. The scene outside was grim. The snow was trampled and stained, but it was over. He turned, and as he did, he swayed, a dark patch spreading across his side. He had been hit. He hadn't said a word. He pressed a hand to the wound and slid down the wall, his rifle clattering to the floor. "Silas!" Elara's voice was sharp with alarm. She rushed to his side, her own fear forgotten, her crutch abandoned. The roles were now completely reversed. She was the caregiver, he the wounded. She ripped a strip from her own petticoat and pressed it hard against the wound, her movements urgent but steady. "Finn, more light," she commanded, her voice firm. The boy, who had remained at his post by the fire through the entire ordeal, his face a small, stoic mask, hurried over with the lantern. He held it steady, his small hands not shaking, illuminating the wound for his mother. Elara worked with the same focused intensity Silas had shown her. She cleaned the wound as best she could with the last of the whiskey and a clean rag. It was a deep gash, a bullet having torn through the muscle of his side, but it seemed to have missed anything vital. She packed it and bandaged it tightly, her touch gentle, her brow furrowed in concentration. Silas watched her through a haze of pain. He saw not the terrified, cornered woman he had found in the mountains, but a person of immense strength and capability. He saw a partner. When she was finished, he was pale, but the bleeding had stopped. She helped him to the bed, the same bed where she had lain broken and helpless weeks before. He sank onto it with a low groan. In the quiet aftermath, with the sun now fully risen and shining on a silent, snowy world, the final walls between them crumbled into dust. They had faced death together. They had protected their home. They had protected their son. Finn stood by the bed, looking down at the wounded man who had traded a horse for him, who had brought his mother back, who had defended them. He looked at Silas, then at his mother, his blue eyes moving between the two pillars of his new world. He reached out a small, hesitant hand and laid it on Silas's arm. Silas opened his eyes and looked at the boy. Finn's lips parted. A word, small and fragile, yet as powerful as any gunshot, broke the silence of the cabin. Silas. It was the first time he had spoken his name. It was the first time he had truly spoken at all. It was the sound of a family being born. Spring arrived as if by stealth. The great mounds of snow, stained and scarred from the winter siege, slowly receded, shrinking day by day under a strengthening sun. The frozen earth softened, releasing the scent of damp soil and new life. Small green shoots, tenacious and determined, pushed their way through the mud. The world was healing, and so were they. The cabin, once a fortress, became a home in truth. The shutters came down, and sunlight streamed through the wavy glass, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The rhythm of their days found a new, gentler cadence. It was a rhythm of creation, not just survival. Silas, his wound now a puckered scar on his side, taught Finn to ride. Not on a great, spirited beast like Teton, but on the old, patient mule, Dust. He walked beside them in the pasture, his hand steady on the boy's back, his voice low and calm as he gave quiet instructions. Finn, no longer silent, would laugh, a sound as clear and bright as the spring water that now trickled down from the mountains. Alara, her leg fully healed, planted a garden. She turned the soil with a shovel, her movements strong and sure. She planted seeds for corn, beans, and squash, her hands tending the earth with a gentle care. It was an act of faith, a belief in a future that stretched beyond the next season. She was putting down roots, literally and figuratively. The fence that Silas had started and left half-finished was now a shared project. He would set the posts, his powerful arms driving them deep into the ground. Alara and Finn would follow behind, stretching the wire, their three figures working together under the vast, open sky. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Their shared labor was a conversation, their comfortable silence a language of its own. They were mending the fence, marking the boundary of their world, a world they had claimed and defended. One evening, as twilight settled, they sat on the small porch Silas had added to the cabin. Alara was humming a soft tune, a melody from a life before. Finn was in the yard, trying to teach a new wooden carving, this one a lopsided dog to sit. Silas watched them, a feeling settling in his chest that he couldn't name. It wasn't happiness, not in the loud, boisterous way other men might describe it. It was quieter. It was a sense of rightness, of things having fallen into their proper place. He had traded his freedom, his horse, for a silent, broken boy. He had thought it an act of foolish pity, but now he knew he had made the best trade of his life. He had traded solitude for family. He had traded emptiness for a love that had grown, like Alara's garden, slowly and steadily in the once barren soil of his heart. So here ends our story of a quiet man, a resilient woman, and a silent boy. It is a tale that began with a foolish trade in a dusty town, a transaction that made no sense to the world of men who valued a good horse above all else. But Silas did not trade for what the boy was. He traded for what he might become. He saw a flicker of a soul worth saving, and in saving it, he found his own. They were three broken people, shattered by the cruelty of the world, who found their way to a small cabin in the middle of nowhere. There, surrounded by silence and snow, they pieced each other back together. They learned that a home is not a place you find, but a thing you build, with sturdy logs and a blazing fire and the quiet courage to stand against the storm. They discovered that family is not always a matter of blood, but of choice. It is the choice to stand for someone when they cannot stand for themselves. It is the choice to share your fire, to mend what is torn, to defend what is precious. Their legacy would not be written in history books or etched on a grand tombstone. It would be written in the green rose of a garden, in the sturdy line of a fence, in the laughter of a boy who had found his voice. It is a testament to the simple, profound truth that the greatest acts of heroism are often the quietest ones, and that true wealth is not measured in what you own, but in what you are willing to give away. Before you go, think on this for a moment. What is the truest measure of a person's worth? Is it the power they command, the land they hold, or the horse they ride? Or is it found in the silent spaces, in the gentle mending of a broken thing, and in the courage to trade all that you have for a chance at something you cannot even name?